Welcome to the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. I'm James Hazelwood, author, bishop, and spiritual companion, bringing you interviews and information at the intersection of a gritty Christian mysticism and depth psychology. You can find all the episode show notes, as well as my free Substack newsletter, Notebooks, at jameshazelwood.net. Now, on to the show. Welcome to episode 84 of the Everyday Spirituality Podcast with me, James Hazelwood. It's also episode 3 of the season 2 rebooted version. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown, who is a wonderful guest talking about Howard Thurman. I've become an avid reader of Howard Thurman since discovering her book and lecture last fall. Howard Thurman, if you don't know, was the spiritual director for the Civil Rights Movement, and his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, went everywhere with Martin Luther King Jr. I wrote about the connection, or the connection between the ideas of Howard Thurman and Carl Jung's in my February Substack newsletter. I'll link to that in the show notes in case you're interested. Anyway, this is a wonderful conversation with Lerita, and her book is a great place to start for those of you interested in learning more about Howard Thurman. In general news, I was recently a guest on the Retirement Wisdom podcast, which is a podcast that's focused for people about to enter retirement or just started. It was about my new book, Weird Wisdom for the Second Half of Life. And Joe Casey, the host, is asking me a number of different questions. You can check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's interesting because that's kind of a corporate focus of that podcast, that the audience there, more professional types. So I try to kind of nuance some of the things I deal with in terms of spirituality into a way in which people could understand it. Also, I just learned of a conference that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to attend, but I would love to. It's in November. It's called Psyche and Earth. It's part of the Civilization in Transition conferences that are held each year in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this one is going to focus on the connection between Carl Jung's psychology and the climate crisis. Civilizationintransition.com is where you can find out more about that. The Hartford International University has announced a new program in eco-spirituality. It's going to be led by Professor Lisa Dahill, who I just had the pleasure of meeting this week, actually. I hope to have Lisa and Nancy Wright, a coworker of hers, on the subject of spirituality and eco-spirituality. So that'll be in a future episode of the podcast. But I wanted to let you know about that Hartford International University program. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can check that out. In personal news, I got a lot of feedback from the Substack newsletter article on the Holy Trinity. A number of you appreciated it. Most of the comments were positive and appreciative, that gave some tools to help understand that very challenging concept. One in particular email that I received was from Ivy, and she wrote that a professor of hers at Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg used to teach, quote, that the Trinity is best understood as a love relationship within the Godhead. It is a love relationship. He also taught that any way we tried to explain it with water or steam or ice or a shamrock illustration simply led us into heresy. which I thought, and she says, thanks for posting. I take her comment as a very positive thing. I think that comment on heresy is really interesting. There's this quote that I was told by someone that Joseph Campbell once said, the mythologist and author of many books on comparative religion. He once said that heresy is the lifeblood of the church. And I've always appreciated that because I think it's true. You need a little heresy to kind of get people going. So I was like hearing from people. You can write me at jim@jameshazelwood.net. A couple of other things. This summer, I'll be on a sabbatical for 6 weeks, part 2 of my 2-part sabbatical this year. I'm working on a new book. It's kind of a memoir, tentatively called Pilgrimage. I'm not sure about that because that's been used quite a bit. But the book is a story about my struggles with certain aspects of Christianity and how I've kind of come to reconnect with it in something I'm calling a symbolic Christianity. I'll also be plan to do some camping in Nova Scotia, assuming that there's still campgrounds there after all the wildfires they've had. Last week, we had our Synod Assembly, which is why there was no podcast or Substack newsletter article. Just needed to focus on that and didn't have time to get to it. That Substack newsletter, if you listen to the podcast and are not aware of it, can be found at jameshazelwood.substack.com. It's a weekly, mostly, sometimes more like 3 times a month, essay on mysticism and psychology. And so I'm working on an episode for this coming week. I think that gives you a little bit of the news. I'm mostly eager for you to hear from Lerita Coleman Brown. She is the author, speaker, heart and kidney transplant recipient, and former psychology professor. She's a graduate of the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation. She lives in Georgia with her husband, and she's got a family of some grown children and 1 grandchild. And she is the author of a new book on Howard Thurman called What Makes Your Heart Sing? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. And so we connected on Zoom a couple weeks ago, and here is that conversation. Today on the Everyday Spirituality podcast, I have Lerita Coleman Brown, and she is an author of a wonderful new book about Howard Thurman called What Makes You Come Alive. And it's so good to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm just very excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just start a little bit about you, and then we're going to spend most of our time talking about Howard Thurman and his teachings. Just tell me a little bit about who you are, what you've done, what you're doing.
So I guess the best way to describe it is that I was born and raised in Pasadena, California, and I began my career as a psychology professor in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and sort of taught at several schools and ended up here in Atlanta at Agnes Scott College. And so I am a professor emerita of psychology from that institution. And I felt very called to stop working about 10 years ago. And I had this sense that I'm a very spirit person. And so I had a sense that the spirit had something else for me to do besides teach psychology courses. So I put myself on a sabbatical and just kind of listened and waited. And in those years, as I moved towards leaving the academy, I decided that I felt very called to become a spiritual director companion. So I entered into the program at Shalem Institute of Spiritual Formation. And that is where I actually got involved with Howard Thurman. We can come back to that. But it was really an opportunity for me to begin to learn more about him. I did not know about him before then, and I found that very disturbing. And so felt very called to start giving retreats on him at various places, retreat centers, the Wild Goose Festival, all these different venues. And I realized that I was not the only person who did not know about Howard Thurman. So, but I was not planning to write a book. But I got this email out of the blue from an acquisitions editor who asked me if I, was I working on anything? And I said, well, I've been feeling like I need to write a book about Howard Thurman for spiritual seekers like myself. I mean, people who want something that is going to enhance their spiritual practice, as opposed to an academic book about him, which were numerous. And so she said, well, let's put together a proposal. And so, as we like to say in my family, the rest is the future. And so, so here I am. This book is out, and I knew at some point that I could not give enough retreats to address all the people that would benefit from knowing about him and learning more about his meditations and his philosophical writings, his ideas about mysticism, all those things. So,
yeah, it's wonderful. And I want to ask you your story, which is in the book, about your personal connection to Howard Thurman. But before we do that, for people that are listening to this for the first time and are hearing Howard Thurman and like, I've heard the name, but I don't know anything about him. Who was Howard Thurman?
Who was Howard Thurman? So Howard Thurman was born in on November 11th, no, excuse me, November 18th, 1899, in somewhere near West Palm Beach, Florida. But he actually grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida. Lost his father at the age of about 7, and lived primarily with his mother and grandmother. A brilliant young man who was also a person that I think was born a mystic. He had a number of mystical experiences, particularly outside on the beaches of Daytona Beach, as well as rowing along the Halifax River in that area. And also began to be very concerned about being terrorized as a young Black boy in the Jim Crow South of the early 1900s. And so he found an old oak tree that he felt he was connected to in some way. And he sat down and he said, I decided that I needed to turn inside to God. And what he found out was what he was doing at like 8 years old was meditation. And so I think he just was a person who had this connection to presence at a very young age. But also a brilliant student. And at the time, Black students could only complete 7 years of education in Daytona Beach, Florida, which, of course, by de facto, prevented them from going to high school. But the community got together and they had him tutored by a local principal. And so he went on to the Florida Baptist Academy, which is now Florida Memorial College. And was an excellent student and graduated valedictorian of his class, which allowed him to then go on to Morehouse College here in Atlanta, College for Men, and graduated valedictorian of his class. And there's this legend that he read every book in the library at the time. Took some courses at Columbia in the summer in philosophy. And they wanted him to come back to teach, but he felt very called to the ministry. And he had some conflict about it because when his father died, they didn't want, his father was a very intellectual man and was not a church, not a member of the local Baptist church that he and his grandmother and mother and sisters were a part of. And so they did not want to host his funeral because they said he had died outside of Christ. And so that gave Thurman pause because, he's a very, like I said, thinking young man, and thought he might be betraying his father by going into the ministry. But he had sort of an experience that allowed him some release from that. So he went on to what was then called Colgate Rochester Seminary, was an excellent student and graduated valedictorian of his class.
I'm picking up a theme here.
One of his professors really told him that he was a really excellent student, and that perhaps maybe he should devote the rest of his life to the timeless hunger of the human spirit, because, racial problems sort of, are kind of social problems, and they come and go. And Thurman was kind of like, I don't think you understand what it's like to live in this Black body. And I think he decided to try to work on both of those issues at the same time. So after graduating from seminary, he got married and moved to Oberlin, Ohio, where he was the pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. And one evening when he was attending a religious education meeting, he got sort of restless and went outside to get some air, and saw a table of books, and bought one. And it was called Finding the Trail of Life. Had been written by the eminent mystic Rufus Jones, Quaker mystic. And he sat down and read the whole thing right there, which is about 100 and some pages. But and he realized he needed to study with him, because what had happened, and I think this happened to Rufus Jones as well, is that as children they were having mystical experiences, but they did not have a vocabulary. And Thurman certainly did not know that there was an entire aspect of theology that was devoted to mysticism. He just thought he was having these experiences. And so he found a way, and we'll just call it through a number of sacred synchronicities, he found a way to, Rufus Jones studied with him for a semester at Hartford College. And Jones opened up his seminar to him, as well as his library. And so he had an opportunity to read all the great mystics, St. John the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Francis of Assisi, just wide, Meister Eckhart, the whole, everybody. So he also, Jones introduced him to a kind of mysticism called affirmation mysticism, where in this particular approach or idea, you go down into God and you come up in community or oneness. And as a result, oftentimes people are stirred to begin to remove all the barriers that keep us from our oneness. And as you know, the Quakers have quite a history of their work with on social justice issues. However, Thurman did find that Jones had a bit of a blind spot, because he was not applying this to segregation in the United States. He was definitely anti-war pacifist type, but Thurman was so grateful for his opportunity to be able to work with him. And so he went on to do quite a bit of writing about mysticism, highly criticized for it, because, at the time, particularly the Black religious leaders wanted tools for liberation. They did not want this lofty mysticism thing. But Thurman actually had a plan to demystify mysticism and to change some of the terminology, rather than mystic or mysticism, use religious experience or creative encounter. And he devoted quite a bit of his time to that and changed the ways in which he presented it. So he began to write more about mysticism and social change. As early as the late 1920s, he also began to write about and talk about Jesus as a leader of a nonviolent religion and non-cooperator. And so he continued along this vein when he, after he left sort of Morehouse, Spelman colleges, where he was there for a few years. His wife passed away from tuberculosis. And so he remarried and moved to Howard University and began to sort of pursue this line of thinking. He went and visited with Gandhi. He actually spent 6 months on a pilgrimage to India. And as part of that trip, met with the poet Tagore as well as Gandhi. That meeting was very vital. Gandhi wanted to know a lot about what was happening in the United States with people of color, particularly Black people. And in turn, he was very much, Thurman was very much encouraged by Gandhi to continue his pursuits in this idea of a nonviolent movement and a movement of civil disobedience. So he came back really excited about that, and had actually published an article called Good News for the Privileged just before he went on that pilgrimage, which later became the basis of his classic book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And so Jesus and the Disinherited, which was published in 1949, after he left Howard University, being highly criticized once again, to start the first intentional interracial and interdenominational church, the Fellowship of All Peoples, which still is, or Fellowship Church, which is still in existence in San Francisco. So he published this book in 1949, and it got the attention of a lot of young activists, Bayard Rustin, James Lawson, Pauli Murray, just a number of people who were actually engaged in a variety of activities prior to what we know as the Civil Rights Movement. They were engaged in some things that would be described as nonviolent direct action, where they would get a group of people and go sit in a restaurant, for example, that had not been integrated or desegregated. So, and actually, Martin Luther King Jr. met Thurman sort of on the page. But I have to take a little pause here for just a second and say that Thurman's second wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and Alberta King, MLK's mother, were roommates in high school.
Well, I did not know that. That's a piece of the story I did not know.
Yes, I think the story is actually in the book that I wrote, but which is really, that it just sort of makes you pause, like, okay, right? So when the Thurmans came back from India, they actually, one of their first stops was with the Kings to have dinner. And Martin Luther King Jr. would have probably been about 7 years old at the time. So we don't know if he was at that dinner or heard any of the sort of enthusiasm about it or whatever, but he really met Thurman, I'd say, on the pages of Jesus and the Disinherited. They did cross over at Boston University, where Thurman left his church in 1953 and moved to Boston to become the first Black faculty member and the dean of the Marsh Chapel there. And he gave lots of sermons there. He and King, because the families knew each other, he and Coretta and Sue Bailey Thurman, as well as Howard, would sometimes get together socially. They would sometimes listen to the baseball games on occasion. So this is how Thurman really became, I call him the godfather of the Civil Rights Movement, or the spiritual architect of the Civil Rights Movement. Because in his book, he kind of lays out a blueprint using Jesus as a person who was in a similar position that Black people found themselves at the time. A minority in occupied territory. The Romans were occupying it, of course, and a person of no status, pretty much. And Thurman just zeroed in on how Jesus really spoke to the people that he was ministering to, and how much of his conversation was about the inward center, the sort of this place of interiority, and who controlled that in some ways, in addition to helping them understand that they were beloved by God. They They didn't have to earn that. And it wasn't just for special people. And I think that's been a difficulty, as we have looked at a lot of religions that are perhaps hierarchical, that, there are certain people that are better than others, et cetera. But Thurman sort of, thought about that deeply and felt like we are all beloved children of God and are worthy in our own rights. He stayed at Boston University till 1965 when he retired. He continued to preach and teach, and actually wrote his autobiography in 1979, and he passed away on April 10th, 1981.
The Jesus and the Disinherited, which is, as you mentioned, the kind of classic, and of all of his writings, probably what he's most well known for. And the story goes that Martin Luther King carried a copy of that with him wherever he went. And there's a critical point in Martin Luther King's life when he is attacked and stabbed. And Howard Thurman goes to visit him in the hospital. I wonder if you could just tell the story of that piece, and in particular, the advice that Thurman gives to King.
So Thurman had this gift, I think, or, whatever it is, part of his mystical sense was he had visions from time to time. And one of his visions was after King got stabbed, he said he just kept seeing King over and over again, and he knew that he needed to go find him, which he did in the Harlem hospital. And he talked with him, and he said, look, I think this movement that you are engaged in has taken on a life of its own. And I think it might be useful for you to take some time off, longer than the sort of standard recovery time, for some silence and some solitude, so that you can fully understand what your role is going to be in all of this. And so it was really after that time that, and as far as I know, in those that have written about King, it's the only time that he really took any time off. But after that time, he went to India to study nonviolence, and to lay a wreath at the grave of Gandhi, because Gandhi had, of course, been assassinated by that point. But yeah, there are 5 volumes of the Howard Thurman Papers Project, and there's correspondence in it. So you can see the letter that King writes and says, thank you very much. It was very uplifting. I'm not sure how much contact they had after that, but there were several people, John Lewis, Jesse Jackson, Vincent Harding, all these people, who were very active in the movement, would go and sit and talk to Thurman all the time, just kind of getting their spiritual mentoring is what I call it.
And in the documentary that I watched, it said that Thurman was criticized for himself not being on the front lines, but more in the role that you just described. Is that the case?
That is absolutely correct. And the beauty of Thurman is that one of the ideas that he introduces to us is this idea of inner authority. And that is that you've got to understand your own self-agency and your calling. He knew he was not called to be Martin Luther King Jr. He was not called to be marching. He said he felt like those kind of political activities would actually distract him from the spiritual work. He was trying to hold the spiritual space and create the sanctuary for those who were called to the street. But he was not called to the street. Now, he was at the March on Washington, there out in the sort of audience, but he was not, and he was just so excited to be part of that and to see these young people, fresh from their work in the South. But that was not his calling. And I think that is one of his gifts to us. We all have a calling, but let us not get wrapped up into thinking that we should be doing something or somebody else's calling. Because even in that movement, as in all social movements, you've got people doing everything. You got people taking care of children. You got people cooking. You've got attorneys filing briefs and getting people out of jail. You've got writers. You've got actors. I mean, if you think recently of Harry Belafonte, he was really active in the civil rights movement, but he was an actor. But he was there. He was helping people, bailing people out. So it takes a lot of people to do a variety of different roles, and he understood that was not his role. And if we can begin to understand that we are being led by spirit, which I think he was a very spirit-led man, to fulfill our role. But even if other people criticize us, just be clear about what is your work to do. So I'm grateful for that gift from him.
And well, that kind of connects with the name, of your book, which is a quote of his. What makes you come alive? I mean, that's kind of the essence of that quote. What is it that first attracted you to Howard Thurman personally?
Well, actually, I sort of stumbled upon him like it was like a holy coincidence. I was looking for. I needed to prepare a final project for my spiritual direction training at Shalem, and I was a bit disturbed at the time that we had not encountered any sort of or I should say, mystics of color. Let me just say that. There was a little Rumi maybe, and a little bit of Hafiz sort of thrown out there, but not, so I thought there must be in the history of the world an African or African-American mystic. I mean, how could that be? Right? So I started asking my clergy friends, if, did they know? And so I felt one of my friends said, "What? You don't know about Howard Thurman?" I'm like, "No, I don't know. It's Howard Thurman." And that was also disturbing. I mean, I'm like way into my 50s, right? And I'm like thinking, what? Who is this man? Where has he been? And I think, unfortunately, what happens, as we know, in big social movements, we sort of, have the set of people that get kind of, put forward. But there are a lot of other people in the background who are doing amazing things. And we always know there's a John the Baptist somewhere, right? Before them, there was somebody else, and then there was somebody else. So I remember I ordered, I think I ordered Meditations of the Heart first. And I opened it up and I was like, oh my God, this is just amazing. What? Meditations are just incredible. And I was not born a mystic, but I was born a contemplative. So,
say something about the difference there.
Well, I think that mystics are people who do have mystical experiences, and as they evolve further, as Thurman would say, they surrender the nerve center of their being to God, or to some purpose that God has called them to, that becomes more important than whether they live or die. And there's this famous quote by him where he says, when I was a boy, I think God placed a live coal in my heart. I was his man, and there was no escape.
Mm.
Right? So, and if you think about most mystics, they do in some way. So they don't always renounce, but they let go of whatever their past might have been to then devote their lives to God. So that's how I differentiate between sort of a person who has mystical experiences and a person who becomes a mystic. Then the contemplatives are people who are just drawn to the presence wherever that might be. So as a little girl, I used to like to go sit out in the wind. It was peaceful, it was calming. I just loved just being that. And I didn't have any vocabulary for contemplative, right? I didn't know what that meant, but I just knew that it was just, every time I saw the wind blowing outside, I was like ready to, go out. And my family just kind of looked at me, and people would come, by the house and say, "What is she doing?" And they say, "Oh, she's just sitting out there." And they're like, "Okay," right? thought that was a little strange. But I now understand that I was one who was drawn. I particularly love stillness. And one of the places that you can just, get some almost immediately is if you go outside. However, if I can get quiet enough, I can feel it in my house, of course. So.
That's a real theme in Thurman's writings, is this inner peace, inner unity. He really talks about that as a central thing that he experiences and is hoping others will as well.
Yes. He believed that spirituality could not be taught, but it could be caught. So he would do all kinds of things to try to spark this sense of presence for people, like when he started out at Howard, he introduced liturgical dance. We're talking early 1930s. He would sometimes read literature, from all over the world, or play certain kinds of music. He at one point would have live Madonnas. That is a woman in costume holding a baby with lights. So he was very innovative with respect to that. And he was a champion of silence and stillness. And so he found, particularly when he moved to San Francisco, he introduced a period of meditation prior to the worship service. He always had a quiet period during the worship service. But he found that when he introduced this period prior to the service, about 20 minutes, requests for pastoral counseling went down. And it was his belief that somewhere in the midst of all of this deep quiet and stillness, whatever the problem of people had, it got illuminated in that. Now, you have to remember that Thurman, was introduced to corporate or group silence with the Quakers, during those, they now call them unprogrammed, they were called unscripted back in the day, periods of people just sitting in silence. And he actually, and I have that quote in the book, he actually describes, sitting in a meeting and, he says, I'm sitting there with all my noise and these people are just like caught up in the presence. And then he says, but all of a sudden, and I can't tell you when, I crossed the invisible line and I was one of them, and we were all there in the presence. And I mean, sure, many people I've had that experience with a group, but I've also had that same experience in my own sitting. If I can get still enough, and he does differentiate between quiet and still. He says, if you can get still enough, you can hear the sound of the genuine in you and others, right? So it's really about sort of stilling yourself and discovering that stillness exists in you as well. And just sitting in that, where you begin to sort of lose the sense of body so that you are now connected to all in that moment. But I think what happens for a lot of people is that they will either say that, well, my mind wanders too much. Well, that's what minds do. I tell people that. You can start out with 5 minutes. You don't have to start out and try to jump in the deep end. But the other thing is that, it doesn't help that we now have all these electronic devices and things going on and headphones and all that other stuff, because it just agitates the mind. And so it makes it more difficult for it when you're trying to sit there and be still.
Yeah, lots of distractions now, more so than ever. Yeah.
And so, but Thurman would suggest you take a lull in doing every day.
Take a what? Say that.
A lull in doing.
A lull in doing. I love that phrase. Oh, yes, that's great. Yeah. Huh. So I want to ask you about something that's in the book. It's chapter 5, it's my favorite chapter in your book, and it's called Sacred Synchronicity: Paying Attention to Divine Intervention. And it starts off with a story that you retell. And then you have this quote, and I wonder if you could just talk about this aspect of synchronicity. We have a lot of people that are interested in Carl Jung's ideas, and synchronicity is a part of his philosophy. So what you've written here is Thurman's views on divine intervention, however, offer a way out of simplistic claims that God ordains everything on the one hand, or that everything happens by chance on the other. Could you just talk a little bit about that chapter and that idea of sacred synchronicities?
Yes. So Thurman felt like we needed to pay attention, to spend more time paying attention to when there's this coincidence where you happen to be in this place and you meet this person and they happen to be connected to some place or someone that you need. There were examples all over his life. I mean, probably the classic one is, he's at the train station all ready to go off to the Florida Baptist Academy, and he has this little trunk, and he goes to, board, and the guy says, well, you can't, this trunk is too big and your ticket won't cover it. And so he didn't have any more money, right? So he sits down there and he's crying. All of a sudden, he opens his eyes. Says, "Man," he hears this voice saying, "What you crying about, boy?" And he hears, and all of a sudden, there's this man there, and he tells him, and he says, "Well, look, if you want to get out of this crazy town, I'm going to help you." And he gives him the money to get on to pay for his trunk. So how does that happen? Is that fate? Or is that a bit of divine intervention? And so he felt like that there were times when the hand of God was somewhere in the middle of things that happened to us. But I think that sometimes we've taken this issue to an extreme where we believe, we will sometimes say that, well, a child passes away or something happens to someone and they say, well, God ordained that or whatever. And I don't think that he would agree with that statement. That on the one hand, we need to pay attention to gifts that are right up in our face, but not necessarily to attribute everything that happens, good or bad, to God. I sort of feel like that. And it's unexplainable. I'm the beneficiary of many what I call sacred synchronicities or holy coincidences, where someone you run into somebody and they happen to have something that is going to benefit you. Or I'm big on discernment, and so was Thurman. I mean, at a certain point in his life, he began to understand that we need to offer these decisions. We need to be able to surrender. And so if you're about to make, I actually try to even give little decisions, right, to spirit, but certainly the big ones, right? And say, I need a sign, or I need to, I want to know if I need to do a particular thing. And I usually get an answer. But what happens is that most people don't want the answer. So they won't put the question out there, right? They want what to happen is what they want to happen, right? So, but sometimes we are asked to do things that we don't particularly want to do.
Yeah. I find a lot of spirituality is about giving up control.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's the big one for people. I mean,
sure.
in my book, I talk about a young man that I'm doing work with, and about being a mystic. He's having all these mystical experiences. So I said, "Well, do you think you're a mystic?" He says, "Well, I'm not sure if I'm ready to give up that much control."
Perfect. So Howard Thurman, people are discovering Howard Thurman, and it seems like, your book is an example. There's been more and more written about him. Just very recently, what do you attribute that to? Why did it take so long for him to get acknowledged by people, yourself included, and I've had many conversations in myself too. I think Howard Thurman came across my radar within the last year. What is there something going on now about him, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are two things. One of them is that Howard Thurman was not a self-promoter. He kind of flew under the radar. He didn't feel the need for any kind of self-promotion. So I think in part, I would also add, he was way ahead of his time. I mean, just in his book, The Creative Encounter, he's talking about neurotheology, but not naming it neurotheology, because that's not what they were calling it in the late 50s, right? So in terms of his thinking, he's not surface, he's deep. And so there are a lot of people that are not ready for that because it's too scary for them. So there's that. But I think that there's been a shift. I've seen it in terms of people more interested in spirituality than there used to be. I know when I started out as a spiritual director companion about 15, 16 years ago, there were people that were interested in this sort of typical crowd. The pandemic, requests went off the page. So sometimes there's got to be so there's that, right? But then there's also, I think people are waking up to the fact that, as Thurman would say, we certainly have learned a lot about the religion about Jesus, and we discuss less the religion of Jesus, such as what was Jesus doing on an everyday basis? How did he treat people? How did he talk to them? What, how was he as a person? I think we are seeing this, particularly among young people who are like sort of, I'm not sure if I'm really interested in all the creeds and the dogma and all of that stuff as a way towards salvation. I think I'm going to go feed my spirit instead, right? So I think there's been certainly a resurgence of interest in spirituality and this hunger that every spirit walking around has for completion, for wholeness. It's there. I think there are more people who I strongly believe that we're connected somehow. And so when I sit in silence every morning and some evenings, I don't sit just for myself. I know that it's for others as well. And I believe that there are more people sitting, like I use Insight Timer, and there's like, 1 million people sitting every day around the world. So I think there's increase. So I think it's causing a shift in consciousness. And people are wanting more out of their religion than just going and doing, the typical church stuff. They want to be able to feed the hungry. They want to be able to have a just world, where there's a recognition of every person's inherent worthiness. So things have shifted, and I think that's why we're seeing more interest, because he was writing about those things. Except for that, he was ahead of his time, and so some people paid attention to it. More people are paying attention to it now.
Yeah, it's really quite dramatic. And every time I have a conversation with somebody, and I'll mention a book, they'll go, "Oh, what?" and really catches their attention, and they're intrigued by it. This has been a wonderful conversation. We've really gone into the spirituality of Howard Thurman. There's so many other aspects in terms of the foundation behind and underneath the civil rights and nonviolence and all that. But I appreciate this particular conversation. So if people are interested in Howard Thurman, where do they go? And also for you, where do they find you and your writings? You've got a couple of different books out and the works that you've done.
Well, first, I think I would recommend for people that they read Howard Thurman, right? So for my people who are more contemplative, I'd say start with Meditations of the Heart. For my more intellectually inclined people, I'd say start with Jesus and the Disinherited. And for those people who, just want to know more about Howard Thurman, they should read With Head and Heart, the autobiography of Howard Thurman, right? So first, I say just jump in. Second, there used to be a great resource at Boston University, sort of like a virtual listening room, but somehow they're migrating their system. But you can go to Candler School of Theology, which is part of Emory University. They have a wonderful collection, both audio and print, of Howard Thurman's work and sermons, lots of sermons on many different topics. If you go to my website, and this is one way to learn more about me, LeritaColemanBrown.com, I have a page devoted to Howard Thurman, which links you to that audio file and print at the Pitt Library at Emory University. So I will continue to be talking about him, writing about him. And I mean, at one point, I realized I couldn't do enough retreats, right, to satisfy the interest and the hunger. So I tried to put it all in this book, and I am now, I'm going to, at some point later in the year, probably put myself on a sabbatical. So, I can listen for what Spirit wants me to do next. So, but I will continue to promote his work because it's just fabulous for all kinds of people.
Wonderful. And I'll put links to all of those books and your website and that Candler site too, because one of the things that I really appreciate about all of those audio recordings is when you listen to Howard Thurman in his own voice, it makes then reading, especially his meditations, just richer. You just hear the cadence, and that makes a big difference. So
there's also one other resource, The Living Wisdom of Howard Thurman, produced by Sounds True, so that you can get like an MP3 of probably 5 or 6 segments. And of course, the recordings are done very well because he recorded them in a great space and place. But that's also a wonderful possibility, particularly for those audiophile people out there who like to listen to things. It's an excellent resource.
Good. Well, I'll put that in the show notes as well, and also the link to the Backs Against the Wall, which is a documentary. I think that was a public television. You're in that. A lot of different folks talk about and reflect on his life. All right. Well, wonderful. And so the book is What Makes You Come Alive: A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman, Lerita Coleman Brown. And I'm so grateful that you were with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for aiding me in my continued work to expose more people to Howard Thurman. Thank you.